Okay, why don't we start? Okay, we're gonna get started, even though it's the lunch hour and people are queued up. So hopefully some people will trickle in. I'm excuse me, I just ate too fast. I'm Nikhil Singh, and I teach in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and History at New York University, and I'm just going to introduce briefly our speakers. Who are all going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. So think about what you want to ask while you're listening. Our first, and I'm going to introduce all the speakers at once, and then they'll speak in that order. Our first speaker will be Tryon Woods, and Tryon teaches in the Criminology and Criminal Justice Studies Department at Sonoma State University. His research includes 2 book manuscripts under development: Death, Debt, and Development, Re-examining Racial Globalization and Decolonialism Through Chiapas and the Niger River Delta, and The Fact of Anti-Blackness, Racist Punishment. Tryon also teaches in the college program at San Quentin State Prison and has worked with communities in New York, Seattle, and Oakland on HIV/AIDS prevention. Tarecq Amer is a PhD student at UC Davis Geography Graduate Group, researching the intersection of race, space, and law. His work has explored legal and social structures that serve to marginalize communities of color within the United States, and the ways in which urban landscapes solidify this marginality, and the strategies that those same communities employ to create spaces of resistance. In addition to working towards his PhD, Tarecq works at a nonprofit in Oakland on issues of economic justice, and he has been doing this work since receiving his MA in urban planning from UCLA. And last but not least, we have Ofelia Cuevas, who is, I'm finding her bio, her very, very brief bio, a President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Ethnic Studies at University of California, Riverside. So, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nikhil, and thank you, of course, to the organizers who probably are eating right now, which is well-deserved. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Critical race theory was very essential in my political and sort of intellectual development in the early 90s, so this is an honor for me. Let me get adjusted here. Can people hear me if I talk this distance? Okay, thank you. So my contribution here to the topic of state violence and intersectionality, I wanted to identify or focus on identifying state narratives within popular culture and how these narratives demonstrate not only the ongoing efficacy of state power, which of course is an all too obvious statement, but more importantly some of the insidious ways in which state power moves under the cover of other names. In other words, a key lesson for our discussions about intersectionality and social justice, particularly the intersection of law and culture, is the recognition that the state is most effective where it is least visible. For example, in the various names that we call each other, such as when men call women out of their name, and in so doing obscure the modes of state violence in which we are complicit. So what I'm going to do is look at hip-hop artist Lil Wayne's song, Mrs. Officer. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this song, okay? I was hoping that at least some people would be, so I wouldn't have to play it. So that takes a little time. But I encourage you to go, you can just Google the song and see the video online. But I'm going to look at Mrs. Officer, the song, to locate contemporary cultural production about power, policing, and law within both the present context of increasing black dispossession and criminalization and the historical context of black struggles for self-determination and representation. How does a popular hip-hop song that explicitly recalls the infamous police beating of Rodney King that set off the historic Los Angeles uprising in '92 provide the sonic and visual landscape that consolidates ongoing black suffering and its invisibility today, and thereby contribute to the conditions of possibility for what's being now called post-racialism? So since I want to focus most of my time on examining how state power moves through gender and sexuality in popular and commercial hip-hop as illustrated by this one particular song, I'm going to give short shrift to the all-important historical and political context. So I'll merely gesture to some of the key features of this context that are essential for examining the cultural politics of punishment in the era of post-racialism. First, we would need to locate this new discourse of post-racialism in the old discourse of colorblindness, which itself in turn needs to be situated in terms of the state's naked criminality against the liberation fighters of the Black Power era in particular, and the black struggle for self-determination generally. Although colorblind ideology and its jurisprudence has been well interrogated by legal, ethnic studies, Africana studies, and other critical race scholars, rarely is it consistently connected to its material base. In other words, to the dirty work of a white supremacist state apparatus that's deeply mired in extra-legal activities. The most well-known example of this, of course, is the COINTELPRO program, the FBI's illegal counterinsurgency program, but a number of other speakers over the last couple of days have invoked a number of other activities, particularly I'm thinking of the state's involvement in the residential homes and the boarding schools for indigenous Americans throughout the Americas, or North America. COINTELPRO, though, as it attempted to destroy activist organizations, also has to be coupled with the mundane killings of everyday black folk by the police. For example, between 1971 and 1973, nearly 1,000 black people were killed by law enforcement, which is a higher rate of state-sanctioned death over one police murder per day for 3 years than during the height of anti-black lynchings around the turn of the century. So colorblindness then is tied to this material context of state violence and illicit state violence. Secondly, we would need to think about the generation of black and brown youth most directly affected by this period, by the era of colorblindness. And the generation I'm referring to is, I mean, we're certainly all affected by it, but the generation I'm thinking about is the children of the Black Power activists of the 60s and 70s, the children who came up in the 1980s and 90s, bequeathed revolutionary ideals in a post-revolutionary or anti-revolutionary age. So this generation of black and brown youth would come to be called gangsters, thugs, and hoodlums, while they would come to call themselves the hip-hop generation. And we would need to explore further the myriad ways in which the post-civil rights era of colorblindness and formal legal equality saw an increase in structural violence against all people, but that hit the black community particularly hard. For example, 50% of black males employed in the manufacturing sector in 5 Midwest states lost their jobs as a result of deindustrialization between 1979 and 1984, and consequently between 1965 and 1990, black family income fell by 50% and black youth unemployment quadrupled. And by the 1990s then, we were seeing for the first time perhaps in the history of capitalism, a disconnect between wages and poverty. Right? So unemployment was going down as poverty was going up because most of the new jobs, as we know, created in the new deindustrialized economy were low-wage, part-time, dead-end service sector jobs, leaving people working a lot more for a lot less. The children of the former black revolutionaries then, to borrow from George Lipsitz in his discussion of this in Footsteps in the Dark, came to know the meaning of race through their experiences facing continuing and cumulative discrimination in housing, employment, and education, persistent police brutality, and toxic environmental pollution in their neighborhoods. Third, third factor, the context that I'm glossing over here, we need to discuss more thoroughly the emergence of hip-hop culture out of this historical moment and its subsequent transformations in the 1990s. So from the promises that break by themselves to the breaks with great promise, as the spoken word artist Sekou Sundiata puts it, the hip-hop generation rose from the devastation of the state's war against black revolutionaries to carry on the tradition of irreverence and creative artistry that historians like Robin Kelly and others remind us have been a central component of black expressive vernacular culture since at least the Badman Tales of Jelly Roll Morton in the late 19th century and the age-old tradition of signifying. We'd also need to assess the effects of censorship campaigns against early hip-hop, which reached its zenith with the emergence of gangster rap, the effort at censoring hip-hop, along with corporate media consolidation, America's post-civil rights appetite for racially stereotyped entertainment, and for violence and sexually explicit misogyny as valued cultural products have together constricted the commercial possibilities for hip-hop. So in short, although I don't have the time to adequately elaborate on each of these three features of the context, the summary suggests that any analysis of hip-hop today must account for the ways in which the present state of affairs in large measure is an effect of ongoing state violence against the black community and its concomitant structural dispossession. This historical and political context resurrects the pressing matter of black consent, a problem that, as Jared Sexton points out, has been explained away by both the slaveholder of an earlier period and the proponents of the crisis-ridden project of U.S. nation building in the post-civil rights era. So we cannot adequately address the links between power and pleasure, agency and affect, subjugation and sexuality, without clarifying, or attempting to clarify anyway, these scalar relations between differing levels of coercion and consent that this history allows. With this in mind, then, I want to move towards my reading, then, of Lil Wayne and Mrs. Officer to show how this turn in hip-hop towards the crass spectacles of misogyny and materialism is itself reflective of state power. So in Mrs. Officer, from his 2008 album, The Carter 3, Dwayne Carter, or Lil Wayne, raps about getting pulled over by a female cop who then pulls him into her patrol car and makes him have sex with her. The song is basically celebrating his sexual prowess, but it does so over a subtext of state power. The women who desire Lil Wayne's sexual attentions are cops, and his sexual boasting climaxes with the refrain, quote, "Rodney King, baby, yeah, I beat it like a cop," unquote. Now, the music of Mrs. Officer blithely undermines and contorts the meaning of police violence, the song's all too obvious subtext. But as with all matters of representation, things are more complicated than they first appear. So for starters, we can see how the post-racial era requires that artists cover up a critique of police violence under the guise of a love song in order to remain commercially viable. And of course, if love song is too generous or a flexible term for this particular song, then substitute your appropriate term. The meanings and potential meanings in Mrs. Officer then are both well buried and hidden in plain sight. Quote, one set of lyrics. "My face in every wanted poster. I'm wanted by every lady cop all over. That ass so big I catch a battery to hold you. My hand so big you thought I told you to pull it over. She pulled me over, pulled me out the Rover. Then she pulled me closer, threw me in the back of the car, put me in handcuffs, start ripping my pants off," and so on. Now, in Lil Wayne's performance of these lyrics, and I, of course, don't even begin to do it justice, he recalls and enjoins a long tradition of black humor, irreverence, and illicit eroticism, in which pleasure intersects with politics, identity, and power. Black youth subculture reconstructs dominant representations of who they are in order to remake their image in popular discourse. Lil Wayne appropriates and recasts stereotypes of black men as hypersexual beings with large penises, quote, "my hand so big," and insatiable appetites, wanted by every lady cop all over. Remember Ice-T? Right? He used to say that, used to call himself a white woman's dream, a tongue-in-cheek conjuring at the same time parodying of the historical mythology of the black man's prowess. Lil Wayne, on the other hand, his gifts or skills command the attention of all females, represented as the whole police force of lady cops. He transforms the definitive trope of undesirability, right, the ubiquitous stereotype of black male criminality, my face on every wanted poster, into a sign of his sexual desirableness. Handcuffs come to mark sexual excitement rather than state violence, drawing on the well-developed play and sadomasochism between pleasure and pain. And the resulting screams of ecstasy emitted from the patrol car where Lil Wayne is, as he puts it, beating it like a cop, mimic the sound of a police siren, turning the omnipresent portent of danger in urban black communities into almost a sort of a gong sound of triumph, if you will. Now, even while Lil Wayne may be attempting to produce the counter-narratives that I pointed to here, how does Mrs. Officer demonstrate how state power works most effectively where it goes unnamed and unnoticed for what it is? So although Lil Wayne may express both a desire for women's sex and a confidence in magnetizing women's sexual service, Mrs. Officer may in fact reveal a tired theme of black male fears of black women's sexuality, as well as a profound muteness on the historical fact of black male and female sexual victimization and the way in which sexual violence by white men is in many ways the essence of racialization. The gender and sex narratives in Mrs. Officer effectively obscure women's ongoing structural vulnerability in a patriarchal society. These narratives skillfully elide the stark reality of gendered violence, particularly in relation to law enforcement, The historical record includes police officers pulling over women and then assaulting them, police officers responding to women victims of male violence and then re-victimizing them, corrections officers violating women prisoners through sexualized frisks, pat-downs, and body searches or sexual coercion in the prison, which, as many of you probably know, these are usually in fact re-violations, since many women in prison are themselves already survivors of sexual violence. Also, the law's general disposition to treat women as causing their own victimization, the endemic incidence of domestic and intimate sexual violence nationally, cross-race, cross-class, and of course, the rampant violence by police officers, law enforcement professionals against their own domestic partners. In this context, then, Mrs. Officer may read as much like a court transcript for a rape trial. I got stopped by a lady cop. She got me thinking I can date a cop because her uniform pants are so tight. She read me my rights. She put me in the car. She cut off all the lights. She said I had the right to remain silent. I know she's the law, and she know I'm the boss. The heteronormativity in homophobia underwriting Mrs. Officer means that the materiality of sexual violence toward the black man is rendered invisible by emphasizing Lil Wayne's reclamation of what Jared Sexton calls, quote, the so-called administrative function in the black man, a function that includes the ability to think for oneself, as well as the crucial right of male sexual sovereignty, unquote. For instance, the everyday reality of sexual violence in the form of police harassment and brutality by white men on black and brown men, which of course in 1997 notoriously culminated in New York City resident and African immigrant Abner Luima's brutal hours-long torture and gang rape by at least a dozen New York police officers. Essentially, in Lil Wayne's words, she pulled me over, pulled me out the rover, then she pulled me closer, threw me in the back of the car, put me in handcuffs, started ripping my pants off. This racialized sexual violence becomes impermissible knowledge. Now, the female cop in Lil Wayne's performance is the critical medium through which the white male desire for and sexual victimization of black men is silenced, and in its place, the black masculine sexual sovereignty is performed. The woman cop, in other words, that the cop is a woman, is necessary to obscure the sexual desire of the white male spectator for the black male body. She's needed to soften the image and thus mute the reality of sexualized state violence against black bodies, both male and female. And she lends the black male power. Lil Wayne purports to turn surveillance on its head by turning it into a conquest of his own. The woman cop, in other words, that the woman is a cop, is requisite for obscuring the widespread realities of female victimization and making misogyny more palatable. As a cop, she deserves getting fucked. As a cop, she started it, asked for it. As a cop, she's not really female. And he's not really using her as a sexual object, since state power is often equated, of course, not always correctly, with male authority, not female. And therefore, he's not really saying fuck you to the police state, which would be commercially untenable. In short, then, the narratives in Mrs. Officer work not simply by what is said within them, nor even just through the narratives that are silenced by inversion, but also in the course of what is called on, what is connected to them and called on through them. That the prison industrial complex has expanded apace with the hip-hop industry is not accidental or incidental. Post-racialism promotes this police state for black America by presenting successful hip-hop artists as the evidence of a colorblind nation, devoid of racial animus and institutional discrimination, while at the same time pointing to hip-hop artists as the evidence of the hip-hop generation's essential criminality and deviance, and thus the need for pervasive and punitive social control against them. Additionally, from the perspective of challenging state violence, Lil Wayne and other rappers frequently become mythical vessels into which the state empties what it needs: sexism, commodification of women's bodies, gangsterism, gratuitous violence, and then attempts to make us all consume it as blackness and or as pleasure. This methodology, of course, is intrinsic to the way the state operates in order to draw attention from what we are actually consuming to yet another narrative of state power that ends up holding us back. Any discussion of social justice in the midst of this reality needs to consider two points along these lines. One, how to critically deploy legal knowledge to empower people in crafting strategies for self-determination that do not necessarily involve the state. And two, how to critically deploy the self-knowledge that does not replicate state narratives. And let me begin to wrap up with a brief example of violence against women to illustrate a little bit further what I mean by this. Scholars who study women's experiences with discrimination, violence, and oppression conclude that the suppression of social justice throughout society has important and deadly ramifications for justice in the intimate arenas of everyday life. And a number of people throughout the conference here have been deepening my understanding of what this means. As women have long pointed out, men can stop rape if they want to. Unfortunately, in regards to rape, young people fail to understand how power works structurally, and moreover, they tend to learn away their agency in the face of this structural violence that turns around and bites them in the form of debilitating interpersonal violence. As we know, young people whose male relations are more experienced with prison than higher education are rightfully distrustful of inviting the state further into their lives. But they're also immobilized oftentimes by fear when confronted with structural violence, in large part because of the form it takes. Right? Sexual violence, for example, in a patriarchal society is omnipresent. In order to learn sensible strategies for personal safety and community empowerment against violence, then without relying upon the state as the solution for the violence that originates there, or is very much taken up by the state, young men and women have to learn how to critique both the violence that renders women and sexual minorities structurally vulnerable and how cultural narratives can participate in displacing the organized and institutionalized sexual prerogatives of men generally and white men in particular. So what I hope to have at least raised here in part is that some of the issues that impinge upon this difficulty between coercion and consent that animates the effort to address state violence reminds me of something that Fred Moten writes in a recent article. He points out that, quote, the cultural and political discourse on black pathology has been so pervasive that it could be said to constitute the background against which all representations of blackness, or the color of black take place, unquote. This context then makes it very difficult, supremely difficult, to confront the ways in which black existence in an anti-black world, in other words, a universe where black life is structurally impermissible, is bound up with the contemporary predicament of freedom, a fugitive life lived and lost, to borrow the words of Saidiya Hartman and Stephen Best. Or, given the crux and the crush of sexualized racial violence in this situation, we can follow Robert Reed Farr, who drives to the graphic heart of the matter in this way. He says, the life of the black is so caught up in the debauchery of white sexual desire, white male desire, that even when slave is translated to citizen or criminal, as Reed Farr writes, quote, it is still possible to sense the faintest hint of the raw milk smell of cum on the breath, end quote. And here finally then, the apocryphal tale of former U.S. Senator Jesse Helms, who carried around one of Robert Mapplethorpe's black male nudes, folded up in his back pocket, and obsessively unfolded and displayed it to prove his point about the necessity to ban such obscene images, which I think illustrates the point that I sought to raise here about the interrelationship of state power, white desire, and black punishment, as well as underscoring the necessity of an intersectional analytic that thinks beyond existing hegemonic conceptual frameworks, not only for recognizing harm, but also critically for how we remedy present injustice. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm fighting a little cold, so if my voice drops, just, let me know so I can bring it back up. In 2001, Muazzam Beg, a British citizen who was born and raised in the northern industrial city of Birmingham, moved his family from England to Afghanistan. He had, prior to this, traveled to numerous countries within the Middle East and South Asia, and through his journeys, he developed a critique of a power imbalance that he felt dramatically disadvantaged the broadly defined Muslim world vis-a-vis the West. Beg's transplantation to Afghanistan was, in many respects, a product of this critique. Indeed, his stated intention for moving was to offer his labor and assistance to the people of that country who were trying to reverse the degradation of more than 2 decades of war. In October of 2001, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the lead-up to the U.S. invasion, Beg and his family fled to the safety of neighboring Pakistan. However, safety was to be an elusive factor in his life. His presence in Afghanistan, coupled with his prior travels throughout other parts of the Muslim world, and again coupled with the fact that he was a Briton of South Asian ancestry, had not gone unnoticed. In early 2002, Pakistani intelligence agents visited his home, shackled him, placed a bag over his head, and took him into detention. A few days later, Pakistani authorities transferred Beg to U.S. intelligence agents who, with tremendous secrecy, transported him in the trunk of a car from Pakistan to Kandahar, Afghanistan, and then on again to Bagram Air Base, so the infamous Bagram Air Base. Upon his arrival to Bagram, members of the U.S. intelligence community, in an effort to force a confession of involvement in terrorist activity, threatened to ship Beg off to Egypt, whereupon he would be subject to the cruelest forms of torture. This threat was never acted upon, though, and instead Beg was held in a cell incommunicado for over 1 year, after which time he was transported to the U.S. military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. After 3 years of captivity there, Beg was released and flown back to Great Britain, whereupon he was promptly arrested by British police, interrogated, and then subsequently released. Throughout his captivity, Beg was never formally charged with an offense. He was never put before a court or tribunal, and for the first full year of his captivity, he was not allowed to communicate with lawyers or family members. He was, for all intents and purposes, transformed into a legal non-entity. The details of Beg's case are debated and remain to be extremely controversial. However, it has in many ways become emblematic of the U.S. global war on terror and the labyrinthine legal structures erected originally by the Bush administration to project U.S. American military and political might across the globe. In so doing, his case also becomes a disquieting addendum to the growing body of literature grappling with the notion of globalization. In the following essay, I hope to place the discussion of transnationalism and the larger discussion of globalization within the truer discussion of imperialism as defined by most post-colonial scholarship. This brief exploration is not meant in any way to counter the discussion of transnationalism that has been developed in academic circles. Rather, it is to show that a violence that has been a necessary component of the global economy and transnational movement of capital and bodies generally has become much more frenetic in recent years, beginning with the global war on terror. This exaggerated violence and the ways in which it is deployed complicates, in a unique way, the discussion of transnational mobility. To adequately address the issue, I must offer at least a cursory summary of the intellectual positions of the more foundational transnationalism and globalization thinkers. While leading scholars on this subject, such as Arjun Appadurai, Aiwa Ong, and Inderpal Grewal, investigate moments of agency in the globalized movement of people, capital, and cultural media, they each do so in entirely different ways. For instance, Appadurai, in one of his central works, Modernity at Large, states, nation-states as units in a complex interactive system are not very likely to be the long-term arbiters of the relationship between globality and modernity. The placement of geographically specific national entities are, then, to him, under unrelenting assault by the flows of people, goods, and cultures. The economic system that has facilitated this global mobility is no longer necessarily dependent upon national structures, and indeed the cultural and political interaction that it spawns works counter to the logic of delimited nation-states. So he's talking about this movement away from the modern nation-state and into this sort of economic structure that can easily transcend borders. The function of imagination within this border-busting new world is central. He states, my general argument is that there is a similar link to be found between the work of imagination and the emergence of a post-national political world. Grewal offers a far more nuanced view of globalization's effect on sovereignty of the nation-states. She states, in this process, which grew in the last decades of the 20th century, the diminution of power of the state has been uneven. Some states have been much more reduced than others, and some states have become even more powerful. Arguing against totalizing definitions of the modern nation-state, Graywall counters both those scholars who would contend that national entities are, by definition, offered an array of sovereign rights and powers, and those, such as Apatarai, who would contend that the liberalized movement of people and imaginative processes mark the uncontrollable collapse of the modern nation-state. To Graywall, the rapid spread of capital power globally, while altering in certain fundamental ways our working definitions of the state, are facilitated by powers contained within the structure and imagination of the nation. Ong also articulates a clear role for the state in the growth and movement of capital. As she so importantly points out, the ability of certain classes of people to easily transcend borders is dependent upon an economy that has reinforced a continuum of citizenship, membership, and rights. Where some have access to a panoply of rights granted to them because of their command over or proximity to capital flows, others have become entrapped by institutions, laws, and borders, and are thereby subject to the demands of global capital rather than actors within it. For many in this latter category, movement, when allowed, is not spurred so much by a liberated individualistic power than it is by a drive for survival. The factory laborers who made the commodities of the global economy operate under quasi-legal structures that enhance the ability of corporations to become far more profitable. Moreover, an entire class of transnational migrants moves across borders without the protection of the economy or law. They work in the first category. They work in dangerously unsafe conditions for limited wages, often because the economies of their hometowns have fallen into a ruinous state, unable to compete with larger economic processes. Finally, as Ong indicates, the explosion of refugees across the border has established an entirely separate categorization of people whose status can too easily be manipulated by state structures. In describing this relationship between the nation and displaced populations, she states, the prevailing practice was not to offer asylum, but to emphasize state policies of control and deterrence. These characterizations of people who are subjected to power, and in Ong's theory of variegated citizenship, hold only a tenuous claim to social membership. Embedded within her discussion, the concept of the nation-state remains alive and thriving, if somewhat morphed to allow itself proper placement in a new economic system. The case of Muazzam Beg falls beyond the extremes of her citizenship, and for that matter, the citizenship claims of the other two scholars as well, and indeed forces us to question the essential function of this notion of the citizen and this notion of the state in a world that is not simply tied to global capital flows, but is more precisely characterized by sharp contrast between sovereign and subject. This contrast has become much more blatant since the inception of the global war on terror, but nonetheless resonates with much older European and U.S. American imperialistic trends. I contend that the positions put forth by Ong, Graywall, and to a far lesser extent Apatarai, attest to the way in which the various actors of the war on terror fit into a critical transnationalism discussion. The unique U.S. American establishment of the unlawful enemy combatant as a legal category calls into question where we stand in the present age on the issue of citizenship and nation-state. The discussions of these leading transnational scholars does offer as a critical roadmap. While Apatarai posits that globalization has marshaled a post-national era, Ong and Graywall argue that globalized capital is dependent on the force of certain nation-states to proliferate and grow. Well-positioned nation-states, in other words, rather than being thoroughly debilitated by a conception of globalization, have become active participants and beneficiaries in its development. Nowhere is this more blatantly evident than in the case of war. Indeed, the U.S. response to 9/11, both in Afghanistan and then subsequently in Iraq, not to mention the countless other nations that have felt the violent touch of the war on terror, has thrived on a renewed characterization of the nation as an independent and necessary actor on the world stage. In contrast to Apatarai's projection in contrast to Apatarei's project to identify the transcendent agency contained within the cultural escapes and flows of the imaginaire as being the crux of globalization, and far more in agreement with Ong and Graywall, I argue that our present age is witness to the elaboration of the strengthened sovereignty of certain nation states precisely through the diminution of borders around certain others. The impact that this has had upon certain bodies is profound and reinforces legal, cultural, and economic structures of empire. The project that lies behind this article is not meant to merely highlight the existence of a reverse negative of the transnational citizen, but to describe a process by which juridical boundaries evaporate for the carriers of capitalism while simultaneously becoming fortified for those placed outside of capital flows. I do not, however, wish to imply that this is a simple binary. Rather, by exploring at the extreme ends, I wish to shed light on capital's need for a fluid continuum of juridical execution in a manner that's reminiscent of Ong's variegated citizenship. Giorgio Agamben discusses the notion of bare life. That's, the person whose body stands outside of the protection of law while simultaneously being entirely encompassed and subject to law, as a means to critically examine the instances in which the sovereignty of a state can lead to systems of total dehumanization. The unlawful combatant and his subsequent nebulous juridical status has become a current example of bare life versus national sovereignty. It is, however, similar to the legal designations that propelled forward projects of empire in the recent past. But this articulation, the current articulation of bare life, is operating in a world of rapid movement and, as discussed briefly above, his nebulous legal status and the forcible movement of his person is dependent upon the mechanisms that move goods around the planet. I just want to make a little parenthetical note that I'm going to be very consciously using gendered terms here. I'm talking about the terrorist or the enemy combatant as him or, as a male, precisely because that's how that entity is characterized in the media. This sort of gets to notions of Orientalism, this gets to notions of racism against those of Arab descent and South Asian descent, that it is a male-centered world, and therefore war becomes a male-centered thing. So I'm not sort of indiscriminately using this gendered term. At any rate, in a curious way, the notion of the condemned unlawful combatant is a clarifying expression of a hidden, though necessary, aspect of the transnational body. The exact converse of a flexible citizenry, the enemy combatant as a juridically and politically defined being represents the totalistic containment of borders and barriers. He is not legally bound and defined by fixed borders. Instead, he is defined legally by the mobile borders that have become incorporated into his own being. Borders are not transgressed or erected based upon any sense of agency on the part of the defined unlawful combatant. Indeed, borders are transgressed and erected by his or her captors as a means to transport his body from one politically hidden black site to the next. In this sense, the movement of these bodies across borders becomes a transgression of their very humanness, as well as the political sovereignty of certain nation states, right? I mean, people are being seized in certain nation states and removed from those nation states without regard to the laws of those nation states. So some states will solidify their claim to sovereignty by transgressing the sovereignty of others. Does this imply a decay of the nation state, or does it point rather to the supremacy of certain nation states over others? The instance of the unlawful enemy combatant may fall beyond the spectrum of citizenship claims as discussed by leading transnational scholars, but it nonetheless operates within the context of transnational movement and late capitalism. Indeed, the global war on terror offers a much bleaker occasion than Apatarei's imaginaire to explore the violence that's intrinsic in the system of globalized capital. This is an occasion in which agency is fully stripped from certain bodies, communities, and nations, and totalizing power is given to others. Where agency can be found in Apatarei's abstracted citizensryscapes, captivity and control in the spaces such as Guantanamo or Bagram or any of the other black sites around the country, around the world, have come to symbolically encapsulate an image of sheer deprivation. Rather than agentic mobility, we see the forced movement of people from prison to prison. The prison camp, as an integral component of the global war on terror, quite easily characterizes the total abrogation of individual rights, as well as the sovereignty of certain communities and nations. In this way, the war on terror has introduced a curious variant in the processes of globalization and transnationalism. The virtually unconstrained project of U.S. military power, aided by political and economic structures, has allowed the United States to challenge the integrity of sovereign borders in the global South, and, in so doing, severely restrict the agency of certain bodies. Ultimately, this phenomenon is not a new one, and indeed has been played out time and time again since the arrival of the modern nation-state. What is unique, however, is the rapidity with which these militaristic maneuvers can and do occur. Just as regulatory systems were put into place to facilitate the rapid flow of capital and commodities around the world, the U.S. since 9/11 has attempted to institute legal structures that would afford unfettered police powers in any country that was deemed to be construed as a threat that needed to be contained. Thus, the tremendous speed at which violence can be wrought upon a village or bodies can be seized and ferried around the globe has become a distinguishing characteristic of the U.S.-American model of imperialism. A specific instance of this power, of course, is contained in the story of Muazzam Beg. And indeed, the reliance of his story on the transmutability of citizenship and national claim can, and in many ways does, can be seen as a real and necessary deformation of our notion of transnationalism. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Well, this is relatively a new project that I started working on this year when I was asked to write an essay about race relations in Los Angeles, and specifically they asked me to write about black-brown relations in LA in regards to state violence, as it seems that black-brown relations has become the kind of new race relations to work on. Since this is a new project, I really look forward to your guys' comments and questions. And the paper actually began with a phone call from a friend of mine who was in trouble. He called and said, you have to do something. Oh God, it's been 3 days. Please call someone. Call anyone. And my friend was calling from inside of Los Angeles County Jail, which is considered the largest jail on the planet, and he thought he was going to die that night. He had spent the last 3 days in a holding cell designed for 4 people with 15 other men, all of them black and brown. He had spent almost close to 75 hours standing upright and still against the wall in the corner of a 7 by 10 foot cell, which in those instances is a really coveted space, not sleeping or eating. He told me later that there was barely room to move or breathe. And his phone call to me expressed that he had a belief, born from desperation maybe, that there would be someone out there, and anyone, who considered his life consequential. However, within the confines of LA County Jail, he was for all intended purposes not a brother or a son or a friend, nor was he even a member of a social category, brown, Mexican, male from Northern California. I'm not sure if there was any real intersection that he actually met up with at that point. And by most sensationalized media accounts, his identification as a brown male should make him feel his black counterpart. He explained to me later, though, that he did not fear dying at the hands of his fellow inmates, regardless of skin color, but that it was clear to him and everyone else in that cell, he said later, that they knew that, quote, that fucking jail was trying to kill us all, end quote. It seemed that the moment he was arrested and processed into Los Angeles County Jail, he was interpolated as a non-human, life regulated to what I will keep referring to, a spatial point of invisibility. And this idea, or this conceptualization, rests on Denise De Silva's formulation of racial violence that, quote, captures how raciality immediately justifies the state decision to kill certain persons, mostly, but not only, young men and women of color, in the name of self-preservation. Killings that do not unleash an ethical crisis because these persons' bodies and the territories they inhabit already signify violence. So his life was no longer consequential, as he was incorporated into a global security architecture that had been and is presently shifting and transforming itself and protecting itself to address what Los Angeles Sheriff's Department calls a new chaotic world, where threat has become increasingly fluid in terms of its identification. According to a 10-year report published in 2007, which means that this project actually started in 1997, which precedes 9/11, this 10-year report published by the Sheriff's Department titled Terrorism Early Warning, 10 Years of Achievement in Fighting Terrorism, the 21st Century Distinction Between, quote, State and Civil Society, Public and Private Domain, Civilian and Military, War and Peace, Police and Army, Legal and Illegal, have been erased a little more, end quote. It explains, this report, that the notion that the nation-state wars, and this is their perception, are disappearing the distinguishing features of threatening bodies that are hinged not on interstate threats, but difficult to recognize chaotic forms of populations that are increasingly identified as criminal and terrorist. The report states, quote, new forms of confrontation have emerged, and the determining factor is no longer ideology or the nation, but race, tribe, greed, or religious fanaticism. And they did say greed, not creed. The seemingly new delineations from which these confrontation emerges now incorporates threats that are interior to nation-state boundaries and that have become part of, as the report claims, quote, a chaotic war penetrated by crime, tribalism, and terrorism, end quote. And these identifiers are tied, I believe, to a registry of players that have become opposing population with inherent characteristics that presumably transcend nation-state identities. More often than not, they are identifiers which translate into human states of being which are dependent upon ideas of criminalized racial difference that we who work on race, as well as intersecting identifiers and race relations, unwittingly contribute to. Even sincere attempts to grapple with black-brown relations and to examine the complex ways black and brown people live together belongs to a lineage of differentiation that reveals a startling relationship to the state and its violent means of population management. In an endeavor to either find similarities or the way that groups rise above conflict in order to partake equally as fully embodied citizens and the practices of democracy, we take for granted the inherent interest of capital and the liberal knowledge and power structures that lend themselves to violence against the racial body. These practices of study and examination, the ones that go on in many different arenas, different municipal structures in the city as well as obviously in universities, these practices of study and examination that identify groups have cultivated a delineation along the lines of citizenship and criminality, the citizen human and the criminal non-human, that exclude the latter from the realm of what I refer to in this project as the LA human. In practice, this creates a nexus of subjectification which provides the state with a cartography of productive human terrain where the LA County Jail is an invisible point on the official map of LA. The global city where Edward Soja, borrowing a slogan from the LA Times, so famously said, where everything comes together. And LA is also considered one of the premier cities of race relations in the US, one of the first to become a majority-minority city, the new millennial link to the Pacific Rim, and the largest city in the state with the 8th largest economy in the world. Los Angeles has come to symbolize a global metropolis with the likes of London, Mumbai, Moscow, Sao Paulo, New York, and Tokyo. And its greatest resource, we are told by Foreign Policy magazine, is its human capital. That being LA's ability to incorporate diverse groups of people and talent as they contribute to its productive terrain and international status has positioned Los Angeles, the magazine contends, as the 6th most important global city. So it seemed as though my friend and the others in his cell that shared the cell those very long days were among the increasing number of people, a population that has been incorporated into the new intelligence operation of the Los Angeles policing structure that uses a system of identification that relies on signified bodies and territories that are translatable as criminal non-human, and maybe non-identifiable on the map of human capital. So black and brown men and women in LA County Jail reveal, I believe, a discursive and material matrix that lends itself to a state-administered violence, which acknowledges racial differentiation and in fact relies on it for its own production, and produces then a unified entity that is identified by its need for punishment, that being the suffering and early death meted out by the state in its exercise of power and self-preservation. So in a time of the massive expansion of the global security system, there is an emerging delineation, I believe, of citizen human versus criminal non-human that brings into question and to be critical of not only black and brown as stable categories of difference, but the manner in which these categories lend themselves to the growing number of individuals behind bars. Los Angeles County Jail, in fact, becomes a space, I believe, that is a reality resisted, the invisible point, by the very practice of human and race relations, as it and its population cannot fit into the landscape of LA's human productivity. The invisible point, a location of eradication and disavowal, is in part produced through the discourses of race relations with a genealogical lineage to the science of population management, which found expression in LA in the formation of a human relations structure, a system of population management predicated on the working of racial knowledge, which continues to take form in the broader present narrative of black and brown relations in LA. And as I stated earlier, Los Angeles County Jail is a formidable space, as the Sheriff's Department claims it to be the largest local jail system on the planet. I think it very well may be. With a $2.5 billion budget and a staff of over 3,000 workers, it holds on any given day an average of 19,000 men and women, and it has for more than 30 years been under investigation for conditions considered inhumane by national and international rights organizations such as the ACLU and Human Rights Watch. And even before the epidemic growth in the state prison system in the 1980s and the 1990s, Men's Central Jail was under litigation for conditions deemed punitive due to extensive overcrowding and acts of physical violence by prison guards. Over the last 3 decades, the overcrowding has continued. As my friend was, inmates are routinely confined 23 to 24 hours a day without room to stand or walk in cells that are often windowless, and the lights, although insufficient for reading, are often left on 24 hours a day, invoking certain sleep deprivation for months, and if time to trial is prolonged, for years on end. The jail has been cited for conditions that have caused immediate and direct bodily disintegration, such as the physical deterioration from lack of required recreation time, outbreaks of staph infection due to extended periods without clean sheets or changes of clothes, subjection to forced x-rays and blood tests, and mental deterioration due to duress of humiliation, strip searches, months without exposure to natural light, forced idleness, and dangerous levels of spatial density. To be sure, under any conditions, the violence suffered by those arrested and held in jail is, according to John Irwin, the cruelest form of punishment in the U.S., with its primary purpose to manage the rabble of any given city. So different than a state or federal prison system, jail reflects the most immediate and intimate violent workings of population management. For the most part, it really reflects policing on the ground. This is what I mean by that. And these are, and the population in LA County Jail are basically pretrial prisoners held pending conviction and sentencing, and they are the immediate subjects of state identification and interpellation as threatening to the security and stability of the public at large. And Irwin explains that this population to be those individuals, quote, not well integrated into conventional society, social organizations, and networks, They are carriers of unconventional values and beliefs. They are even offensive, capable of arousal, and proto-revolutionary," end quote. Most easily defined as a dislocated people, this population is managed and is administered in a manner that maintains them in a rabble status, a permanent population on the outside of the realm of liberal democracy, outside the realm of the LA human. And the demographic makeup of the 1.6 million prisoners that the county jail transport each year is difficult to assess, as the Sheriff's Department has kept race and ethnicity statistics for only the past 7 years. It is clear, though, that the present population represents a racial schema that speaks clearly to the productive and violent work of the state in an era marked by the prevalent discourses of a post-racial era. Cumulatively, black and brown inmates of county jail make up over 80% of the globe's largest jail population, a population that live and exist in close quarters and share the life-threatening experience of suspended punitive suffering and racial state violence. And this is an extraordinary number in a city and county of 9 million people, especially as it is overlooked as a location of itself of transcending conflict. Ultimately, this population lives together every day at the invisible point of human eradication and signification, and yet popular representations have been sensationalized anomalies that become the prevailing narratives of contention. Volatile and violent moments such as the death of Cheryl Green, a young black girl killed by alleged Latino gang members, which became through discourses of racial knowledge and media spaces and insider cultural understandings, as an incident that turned into a symbol of, quote, ethnic cleansing, unquote, by Latinos against blacks. And these volatile moments have become the symbols of the relations between the black and brown populations that we as ethnic studies and legal scholars and critical race theorists are concerned with and seek to improve. However, the ways in which we've come to understand race and race relations in the past, especially those that are contentious, such as the volatile relations between Mexicans and Anglos in the 1940s and blacks and Koreans in the 1990s, have led to a formative comprehension of the individual human subject made up of attributes that are in opposition to the criminal LA non-human subject. And so the LA human becomes or is the proper citizen subject that exists in discursive and material spaces, such as celebrations of the 21st century postmodern urban hybridity, or the fusion of shared cultural exchange that have been part of the city's narrative to promote urban development. I mean, I think many of us might know those stories of LA being the premier postmodern city in that manner, especially in relationship to culture and cultural productions. And this human, the LA human, I believe embodies a set of liberal democratic ideals that are undergirded by human science identification, social science differentiation, and enlightened humanism. A fully incorporated entity, the LA human partakes in the goods of liberal democracy by virtue of its human capacity, representability, willful, conscious self-determination reasoning, and its inevitability and its right to the inevitability in its right to disavow in the name of local, national, and imperial security and stability. This narrative justification and its material manifestations result in the LA non-human, a non-being interpolated by, incorporated into, and processed through the county jail system that is as reliant upon racial differentiation as the discourses which celebrate LA's multiculturalism. The points of identification, the markers of a proper citizen subject, I believe is the cartography by which the LA human citizen is understood and juxtaposed to the LA non-human, a population emblematic of threat and instability to the ideals of democracy, whom necessitate violent management in order to protect the ideals of democratic social justice and private and state property from their racialized presence. The implicit dichotomy between citizen human, criminal non-human, produced and enforced through the institutional ideals of human relations and thereby race relations, has in part enabled the dehumanization and ultimate eradication of the criminal racial body. Institutional discourses of human relations that have been designed to develop and improve relationships between groups of differentiated peoples through programs promoting unity, tolerance, and coalition building emerge, I believe, from a disciplinary foundation in the human and political sciences, which are undergirded by the violence of the ideals of the universal. Anthropology, sociology, psychology, as well as economics and law and later planning are key disciplines to determine group difference and to ultimately identify and categorize groups within an ecological framework in which the ideas of natural science that inherently and necessarily divide individuals in human and animal categories. Race relations work, I believe, is theoretically one of management with a goal towards productivity. In Los Angeles, that productivity translates to a usable or unusable human capital. The exclusion and regulation of this population, those in the to the realm of invisibility, so those in LA County Jail, is not, I believe, is not simply an oversight, but a disavowal by the human that in and of itself is an act of violence, as it renders this population subject to indiscriminate policing and punishment, as well as moral and social judgment. And in effect, these discourses ultimately serve state violence as they render a critical delineation between a proper citizen subject and the disavowed, the LA non-human. So how does this black-brown population that survives, if it does, and lives, quote unquote, together within the confines of a place that produces the materiality of race, exist not only outside the narrative of proper multicultural race relations, but through this very exclusion underlying the emerging post-racial racial subject of the criminal non-human and the work of race within that. And importantly, I think this begs the question, how have the projects of human relations and sociology of race relations and the state-sponsored management of conflict and institutionalization of reconciliation been used to marginalize, police, and ultimately eradicate black and brown people? In other words, how and why have race differentiation, its intersections, and race relations become an increasingly important category in the production of a global security architecture and the eradication of black and brown bodies? Thank you.
Okay, we have not any time left in the session, so let's stay for 15 minutes, if we can, into the break and see if there are questions for these really incredibly wonderful papers. So I think there's a lot to talk about. So if people are willing to stay, let's just go into like 10 after 2. Nina?
So I loved your talk very much. And I have a question for you, but since I have time...
Actually, what I propose is we take maybe 2 or 3 questions or comments if they're there, and then let the panelists respond. So go ahead. Yeah.
But I wanted to talk to you two specifically. I'm concerned about the gender dimensions of both of your projects. And I say it, I wouldn't say it normally, but because I like your projects, I'm saying it out of genuine collegiality. I like your projects. In terms of the Lil Wayne, Miss Officer, I don't know, I've never heard the song. But I feel like there's another way to interpret the song, and I want to know if it's possible to understand it this way, that the interaction of Lil Wayne with the police officer actually exhibits the rape of Lil Wayne by the cop, and that the black man and the black man's inability to consent in this state environment ever. And so it's his way, it's Lil Wayne's way, notwithstanding the misogyny of the song, right? I mean, I know that the song is fundamentally misogynistic, but our anti-racist efforts tend to be misogynistic. So this is consistent with our other anti-racist efforts. So what I'm saying is it possible that the song exhibits Lil Wayne's effort to function in an environment where he can't ever consent, ever under any circumstances? And then for for you, I wanted to talk about, you mentioned that war is male-centric. It was something that came out, you said it, you said those words, war is the reason you're using he is because the terrorist is constructed as a he in the media, which is true. But they, Guantanamo is children's men. And then the war becomes male-centric, right? As represented, it's male-centric. Is that not what you meant?
Yeah, no, and perhaps I need to clarify that a little bit. War, okay.
So, my talk yesterday was about how war is female-centric. So it's like the opposite of your talk. So I think it's an interesting engagement. The Palestinian women specifically have been targeted in modern day media for raising sons, young boys who throw rocks. And then women are eroticized by the war, were represented as subjects of the war, either that need to be saved by white men, or that are willing to take up guns to support our own patriarchy. And then on top of that, you have the element of rape. Our bodies are raped in service of the war. So I want to hear more about the gender dimensions of your project.
Okay, maybe if there's another, maybe take one more, two more questions. Try to keep it brief. Yeah.
Georgia talk, and I was wondering if you, it was noticeably unmentioned about other prisoners as agents of the state when it comes to prison rape and its role in enforcing standards and norms for the prison population and also the outside population. Because generally speaking, as much as solitary confinement for a year and whatnot seems unmanageable, I think for most people, or let's say men, the fear of prison is prison rape.
Okay, so in some ways each of you have a question. Do you want to just go?
I wouldn't disagree with that. But I also think that in that way, it's still the state because of that confinement, because of how it exists in. I mean, I'm not going to say one trumps the other, and I'm not going to say that one. But it is the prison in and of itself that enables that particular type of violence. So I agree with you. I'm familiar with. I'm pretty familiar, unfortunately, with the fears of the everyday fears of what folks suffer in jail. So I agree with that. But I also believe that that's one of the work that the prison does, that the state, that in and of itself, that jail makes that happen, makes that possible. So just stepping away from it. But I agree with you. So I don't disagree. I believe it's part of the violence that I'm talking about. So.
I guess I was just wondering, it seems to be very central, but then it was not really discussed or mentioned. I was wondering if that was conscious, that you were trying to avoid.
No. I'm not. I mean, this is a really, it's an indictment of two things. It's an indictment of state violence, and it's kind of an indictment of like the idea of race relations and what that lends itself to. So, no, I wasn't avoiding that at all.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. Maybe you could say a little bit more about, because I don't disagree that what I was trying to talk about here was the way in which within these these different levels, these different spaces of coercion and consent, how do we see these state narratives, these operating, right, through, in this case, popular culture. And this is just one illustration, right? So I very much agree that in a society where consent has never been part of the mode in which the state relates to Black America, but to Black bodies, right? It's primarily coercion and relations of force, primarily, right? And then maybe secondarily consent. Then yeah, this is partly what I see as a result of that. Maybe it'd be helpful for me, or probably for all of us, for you to maybe say a little bit more about what you see there, because I'm not sure I fully understand the challenge.
I think we should.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I was speaking specifically about the bodies and the construction of the terrorist who is put into these sites like Wagram, like Guantanamo Bay, and how the discussion of that, the larger discourse of that, is an extremely gendered one, extremely problematically. Of course, I categorically agree with you that there's this whole, the way that in the global war on terror, Arabs in particular are dehumanized, sort of split off the gender. So, in terms of women, the women become complicit in that they are, and this is the discourse that's happening, a lot of the Zionist discourse, that the women are creating these potential threats to Israel's security and to its well-being. So the women are held at fault. The men are held at fault because they are the active agents. They are the ones who blow themselves up. This is sort of the descriptive discourse. And really, one could and probably should write many, many papers just on how the global war on terror is a completely gendered, phenomenon. But I was speaking really specifically to the enemy combatants and how they are always characterized as male. And really, to be quite frank, if you look at the number of prisoners in Iraq who are women, they go unnoticed, they go undiscussed. But there's certainly a lot of women who have been seized and put into similar black sites within Iraq. We don't know anything about it. That's not part of the discussion. It's always about the men. So,
Other comment or question? Do you want to go ahead? Let's squeeze one more in because we're getting pressed from the outside. I can hear them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Specifically in relation to the active role that LAPD and LA prisons play in the U.S. empire, right? So there's a way that this narrative of interracial conflict, international conflict gets circulated through that process.
Well, this might be like a really kind of like practical, very real life example of what you just said. This report that I talked about, this 10-year report, was written by the Sheriff's Department, is actually, and has been distributed with, like policing structures and security structures in Israel, for example, in Mexico City, for example. In fact, the head of the Sheriff's Department, Lee Baca, and Bratton and the police chief Bratton end up being international consultants. And so I'm not sure if that kind of answers what you're getting at, and along with those things comes this idea of trying to understand groups in relationship to one another, right? As those are always seem to be part of like these security projects.
I'd just add quickly to that. You can look at international development documents from the World Bank and other places, and they really foreground the need for criminal justice reform in a lot of the global south as contingent upon receiving loans for structural adjustment and improving economic situations. So there's Ophelia's, I'm sure she could expound for a long time if we had the time about that conjunction. And it is very much a global process, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think all your papers also point to the idea that we really actually we need to decenter the war on terror a little bit in terms of how we understand the emergence of a kind of post-civil rights global security regime in which there are erasures of boundaries in terms of the projects. That there's new kinds of coordination happening across from the internal security apparatus through to the military project, and so the foreign and the domestic, at least in terms of the United States, are being significantly erased. In some sense, the question of sovereignty becomes really the question of the United States attempting to kind of monopolize sovereignty at a global scale and to enlist other nation states in various kinds of junior partnerships within this kind of global security regime. And it seems to me that your papers make this incredibly interesting arc, really from the sort of the end of the war on the black poor, which is much more explicit in the late 60s and 70s to the current moment. And we all have, I think, a lot of work to do to kind of flesh out that period and its logics. So, I mean, beautiful papers. Thank you.